They tore her down in front of silver and silk. He Jingchuan rose slowly, the silverware catching the lantern light as if everything in the room conspired to spotlight his face. Glasses chimed like small accusations. His voice was calm, practiced, the voice of a man who had learned to command rooms, to make announcements that bent reality to his will. "This ends tonight," he said. The words landed like a blade. His mother laughed, a sound like breaking porcelain. His father, an old man with a scalp as smooth as the auction hammer, nodded, satisfied. The cousins leaned forward, delighting in ruin. "You're nothing but a vegetable seller's wife," one aunt spat, as if naming a crime. "You brought shame on our name." Hands pointed. Laughter rose in the high-ceilinged hall. Somewhere the band's melody faltered under a tide of voices. White Lime felt the room tilt. It was as if the lights had gone out and a single spot remained on her chest. She could still feel the weight of the promise ring on her finger, a small band of something bright that had once been everything she knew about hope. He Jingchuan had placed it there 7 years earlier, beneath the peeling neon of the fruit stall where she worked. He had said things that made her bruise with gratitude, quiet vows that sounded like a future. She had believed in the future because she believed in him. Now he stood and spoke of ambition and appearances. He spoke of the company's image and the shame of being connected to her. He spoke with the stare of a man who needed the world to see he had chosen strength over weakness. Then he unfolded a folded paper with the neatness of finality and said plainly, "I want a divorce, tonight." A hand, an aunt's greedy and sharp, reached for the ring. It was the most theatrical move of the night, to remove the sign of a promise in front of the assembled guests. The ring slid past White Lime's knuckle and clattered onto the table as if its fall could be heard by every corner of the city. Someone gasped, someone cheered. He Jingchuan's new favorite, Shen Sisi, smiled as though she had been granted a jewel. She didn't touch the ring. She only watched, the kind of calm that makes people forget mercy exists. White Lime sat very still. The room's laughter and jeers rolled over her like waves. They called her names. They mocked her work, her clothes, her past. Some reached to touch her hair, as if to prove something, to feel the texture of the scandal. One of the young masters, dressed in a suit that cost more than she had ever seen in a life, blurted a joke that landed in the center of her chest and left a hollow sound. Her cheeks were warm with a humiliation that was not hers alone. It was the city's. Someone snapped a picture. Phones bloomed like paperflies, capturing the scene for a world that would later nod and confirm their cruelty. He Jingchuan did not raise his voice. That would have made it worse. He merely announced, cool and absolute, that the association of his name with hers was intolerable. He said he would protect the company. He said he would reclaim the future he had been building. He said he could not be held back by private burdens anymore. The finality in his voice transformed the room's cruelty into an official act. Divorce papers were demanded, signatures collected. White Lime's mother-in-law called for a carriage. The banquet guests spilled back into their lives, folding the night like a script with the lines that suited them. When the door closed behind them, the room diminished until it was only the echo of their steps and a single faint perfume that had clung to Shen Sisi's sleeve. White Lime sat in the middle of empty plates and glittering disposables and thought of the ring lying like a coin on the long linen. Her fingers trembled when she reached for it. The promise felt like a fossilized thing now, a relic from a life stripped while the crowd applauded. If this story is already gripping you, stay with it. The truth that follows makes the laughter sound very small. They left with the confidence of those who believe history favors them. He Jingchuan took Shen Sisi's hand in public as if it were a new flag. The elders adjusted their cufflinks and practiced their indifference. The cameras had what they needed, a spectacle of ascension wrapped around a scapegoat. The next day's headlines would glow like embers. For 7 years they had shared a modest apartment near the river market. White Lime had fresh-cut vegetables stacked in neat baskets in the morning and a kettle singing softly in the evenings. He Jingchuan had come to her with an earnest, messy charm, sleeves rolled, eyes hopeful. He had been different then, less polished, less unmoored from dreams. They married in a small ceremony with 2 old neighbors and a stack of paper lanterns. He pressed a ring into her palm, saying he was going to build a life that would let them look at the sky and not the rent. She believed the look in his eyes. Those years were not all gentle. He had ambition. It had always burned behind his smile, and sometimes it burned him and everything around him. He took night classes, learned numbers like prayers, made friends in buildings with glass and men who spoke softly about mergers. He traveled for deals, returned with sharper suits and stories of what the city could be if he only reached high enough. White Lime learned to read balance sheets the way others sifted soil. She listened and folded the small triumphs into her mornings. She cheered when he closed a small contract, mended shirts while he planned an elevator pitch. They were 2 people holding on to a fragile building thing called a future. Shen Sisi arrived like a photograph. She was a secretary at first, efficient, glossy, a woman who knew exactly how to place herself at a table in a way that made others feel they were in the presence of someone who mattered. She did not make promises, she arranged landscapes. She laughed with the right timing, wore a perfume that spelled confidence, and took notes with a pen that looked like jurisprudence. She knew every contact in the city's quieter corridors. She began to appear at company dinners. She began to stand a little closer to He Jingchuan in meetings, offering solutions that smelled like profit. Rumors gathered like rain. Deals that had once been impossible suddenly turned favorable for He Jingchuan's firm. Invitations arrived with a certain weight. White Lime watched from the kitchen doorway as the world came to her husband's side and wondered if the world had always been like this, requiring the right shape of people to open the doors. She swallowed jealousy and learned the art of being small in the right moment. She loved him enough at times to let him go where he needed to go, believing his promises like a child believes in shelter during a storm. Then the storm arrived, not as weather, but as rumor. A major buyer, an overseas conglomerate that had once been cordial, reported issues and paused cooperation. Contracts were said to be in question. Investors murmured. Papers called the event a hiccup. In private rooms, it was called something sharper, as if a body had been punctured and a hush fell in the veins. Their largest client's silence was like a hand stepping back from a cliff's edge. Without it, liquidity tightened and the company's bright lights dimmed. He Jingchuan's hand on the boardroom table hardened. The meetings multiplied. Fingers pointed for causes. He needed a scapegoat, someone to say the company had not failed because of greed or risk, but because of soft distractions. A personal life out of step with the polish required in high places. An old acquaintance who owed a favor suggested that domestics and companions were sometimes used as reasons to cut losses gracefully. Whispers stitched themselves into headlines. Family drama affects operations, one column intoned. Executives caught in personal scandal, said another, with a picture of White Lime's modest face beside He Jingchuan's more composed one. The elites gave each other knowing looks. The company's stock wavered, then sagged. Men in suits began to remove themselves in stages, their shoes making noises of retreat. He Jingchuan stood where the board's decisions were made and recited the litany of corporate necessity. He announced steps meant to reassure shareholders, tighter oversight, managerial shake-ups, personnel reviews. He spoke of the future with a new discipline, as if he had swallowed a doctrine that required leaving behind anything messy and human. When his mother suggested that his marriage might be a liability, his eyes softened with gratitude. "You are right," he said quietly. "We must be careful." The divorce was a decision dressed as strategy. In the public's mind, it would be practical. In White Lime's mind, it was devastation wrapped in logic. The in-laws arranged for departure as if they were shipping off a piece of unwanted cargo. Shen Sisi took a table at the company's gala and smiled while the cameras did their work. He Jingchuan kissed her fingers in one of those gestures the press called close, and the city's click turned to a soundtrack that confirmed everything. White Lime left with a bag of clothes that had seen better markets. She moved into a small rental room above a noodle shop, the kind of place where conversations flowed through the ceiling at midnight and stockbrokers' children never came. She started working mornings again, but not selling vegetables. She found a job at a community clinic in a corner of the city where dignity was measured differently. She returned to a life ordered by small necessities, a kettle, a sweep of sunlight, a quiet that did not interrogate her worth. Men on the street referred to her as the poor woman, their voices thin with the pleasure of gossip. Children sometimes pretended to imitate the scene they had seen on their parents' phones, gesturing at silk and throwing invisible rings. White Lime learned to keep her head down and mouth closed, but she did not break. At night she would touch the ring under her coat. It had been returned to her. An aunt had tossed it back like an object that had been used and worn out. The ring did not fix the bleeding. But when she rested her thumb against it, she remembered the strong, raw voice that had attached promise to the metal. She remembered a time when a man had loved a woman enough to speak of a future. The memory was a wound that taught patience. In the weeks after the banquet, something else happened that would later seem like the first stitch of fate. A card, small, heavier than paper, appeared folded in the lining of a coat she had left at a laundromat. It was a golden invitation, embossed with characters that fluttered with old authority. It looked ridiculous in that coat pocket, out of place among laundry lint and a lost button. White Lime had almost thrown it away. She did not. The card fit into the hollow between her ribs. She kept it folded in her purse, not because she believed in it, but because she did not want to be entirely certain of her seeming insignificance. When she opened it, the gold wrote a name she had never heard of, a clan that sounded like distant thunder. Bai. There was a seal that suggested centuries and a promise of belonging that felt as fragile as the paper itself. People in the markets had heard of the Bai family, large, opaque, more a legend than a household. White Lime did not know what to do with the card. It was the wrong currency for her life now, but it sat there like a secret companion. The company's troubles deepened. An alleged act of sabotage was whispered. Someone inside the firm accused of handing intel to rivals. Someone named Yang Shikun floated like a scapegoat in the accounts of journalists who loved drama. Contracts vanished as if actors had left a play because the stage was set poorly. Deposits froze and partners expressed concern. The nature of the fallout was murky, and the boardroom became an arena for blame. He Jingchuan's friends turned protective in ways that often mean punishment for the one who had been tied to vulnerability. They whispered about damage control. They organized a night to remind the city who still mattered. Their chosen instrument was an auction, an ostentatious, tightly curated event where echoes of lineage and whispers of money were translated into the language the elite understood. It would be a night to display taste, to buy symbolic objects that signaled influence, to reinforce alliances. And, quietly, deliberately, it was also planned to be a spectacle that would mark where White Lime belonged. An invitation to that auction arrived at He Jingchuan's office on embossed paper. The card promised lanterns and lineage. It promised recognition from the Bai family, rumored patrons of every great city theater and auction house. The auction would be the place the city's elite measured one another by the width of their wallets and the subtle inflection of their names. It was also the place where the Bai family sometimes distributed tokens, golden invitations that were less ceremony and more sanction. He Jingchuan decided that the auction was the perfect stage to finish what had been started at the banquet. He would bring his new life, Shen Sisi at his side, relatives aligned like chess pieces, and the public would be reminded of the necessity of his choices. The strategy was simple: show strength, imply moral rectitude, and ensure the company's partners saw a man who did not waver. He told himself he was protecting all that he'd built. Others told him he was showing the city he had dared to evolve. White Lime heard a rumor of the auction through a nurse at the clinic who had a cousin in events. She pictured a room full of cold eyes and glass. She imagined laughter sharpened like knives. She imagined being a footnote in someone else's display. She could have stayed away. Pride, the type that is not loud but steady, kept her from hiding. Perhaps she wanted to watch the men who had judged her in action. Perhaps she wanted to understand how much the world had changed. She kept the golden invitation folded delicately in her purse and thought of why it was there. The auction night arrived like a tide. The hall glittered with lanterns. The Bai family had lent their name to the event, which made it feel like the city's heart had been invited to watch itself. 4 young masters, men whose faces had been posted and praised in the society columns, sat near the front, their shoulders broad as banners. Men in suits arranged themselves with the certainty of people who had never been shamed in public. Women in gowns steered conversation with controlled sips of champagne. White Lime stepped into the hall and felt the air seem to shift. She wore a plain dress, chosen to avoid attention. People turned to look, not because she demanded it, but because her presence completed a narrative they wanted to consume. The in-laws sat near the auction center, glancing at her as if she might still be dangerous in the same way a small ember can become wildfire. The auction director, Chang, took the stage with a voice that smelled like old wood and authority. He spoke of objects that were more than objects, of histories and tokens that could bend destinies in ways none of the city's new millionaires could grasp. He held up a jade brooch, and the crowd admired its thin vein of green. Bids rose like birds until the brooch landed with a gavel's final sound. The 2,000 candles in the chandeliers watched each sign of conquest. People loved the shape of power when it was sold on a pedestal. At the center of the room, in a case lit by a subtle, reverent glow, lay a stack of small cards encased in glass. They were golden invitations, tokens of favor, coordinate pieces of recognition from families whose names moved the market. They had been treated with the care religious relics command. The crowd drifted toward them like children to a prize. He Jingchuan moved through the room like a man walking the plank. He talked, smiled, nodded. Shen Sisi's presence was a study in composure. The four young masters glanced at the golden case with something like hunger. White Lime remained at the edge of the crowd, under the shadow of a pillar, her purse pressed to her side so that the card inside might not flutter out and reveal itself. An assistant, over-polished and precise, announced an item more curious than the rest, a collection of seals and tokens once reputed to be holdfasts of old clans. A hush fell. The auction house buzzed with the kind of breath that precedes decisions framed in zeros. Bidders lifted paddles, and the numbers drifted. He Jingchuan bid with the assured rhythm of someone used to directing outcomes. Someone whispered that having a buy seal meant an entree into corridors otherwise barred. White Lime watched the motions and felt the night's earlier hum of cruelty coil in her ribs. She thought of the ring, of the laundromat coat, of the folded golden invitation in her purse. She remembered an old neighbor from the river market who had once told her, "You can be mocked for what you sell, but nobody can tell you who you are." The line had returned to her with the insistence of a bell. She breathed. Someone, an offhand guest, spoke loudly enough that it rippled. "Didn't she used to sell vegetables? What is she doing here?" Laughter rippled, and someone raised a glass. White Lime felt it like a stone in her stomach. She waited for the tide to swallow her. And then the night shifted. An elderly figure rose from the back of the room. He was slight, cloaked in a coat the color of winter bones, and when he walked, people moved aside as if a wind carried him. He held a cane, not because he needed one, but because the weight of its wood gave him presence. He asked for silence in a voice that held the texture of old commands. Chang, the director, paused mid-gesture and looked toward him with something like recognition. He approached the case where the golden invitations lay. No one stopped him. He took a seat at the front and reached out a hand that trembled just enough to prove his age was not acting. He placed his palm on the glass as if assessing a pulse, and then, in a small deliberate motion, lifted a token held in a velvet cushion. White Lime felt her heart ratchet. She pressed her fingers into the purse and felt the card between her palm and the leather. Real, absurdly heavy. The room leaned forward. Someone's laughter died. The chandeliers seemed suddenly too bright. A man at the far side of the hall, the kind who sold influence with a smile, whispered to his companion, "Is that?" The words hung like a question mark too large to ignore. He Jingchuan's face, which had been composed, tightened. Shen Sisi's smile faltered by a breath. The four young masters shifted in their seats. The elderly man raised the token he had taken from the cushion. He spoke two words in a language that made the people in the front row straighten involuntarily. It was not a sentence of explanation. It was not even a name. It was a recognition, a small sound of payment that folded the present into the past. All at once, every polite smile in the room looked brittle. The golden invitation glowed like a signal flare in a sea of indifferent suits. White Lime's fingers were white on the card now. She did not move. Outside, far away as a drumbeat, lanterns rose and fell with the city's breath. The crowd was still enough that a dropped coin might have been an event. Someone whispered her name without meaning to, actually said White Lime the way you say something private and wonder if it is suddenly public. Heads turned. He Jingchuan sat like a man who had misread the weather his entire life. His hands were not yet trembling, but his pulse was a drum beginning to race. He had come to the auction to assert his new life, to put a marker down and say, "Look, we made the right choices." He had not come to see the world cooperate in returning the past to someone he had deemed small. The elderly man held the token high and slowly turned. In the quiet, the seal caught every available light. Someone in the audience muttered the name of the Bai family like an invocation. Another corrected them with a more precise syllable, as if the pronunciation of a name could change history. White Lime's skin prickled. She had not intended to be noticed. She had not intended to show her card. The golden invitation in her purse suddenly felt like a drop of cold water on a feverish lip. It was as if the card remembered things she did not. A carriage of murmurs moved the room like a tide. An attendant leaned forward and asked the elderly man a question. The man looked toward the center of the hall, and the world of lights and tasting spoons and champagne flutes grew hushed in response. Someone near He Jingchuan hissed between teeth that this was absurd. Another voice said, "Performative." A woman at the back, sharp as a knife, started to stand, as if to assert that they all needed to remember who they were. He Jingchuan's mouth worked into a smile that did not reach his eyes. He squared his shoulders as if to reassert the stage. He had rehearsed this part of his life, the image of a man who had the courage to discard what restrained him. He had not rehearsed being a spectator to his own possible undoing. White Lime's chest hammered. The golden invitation felt suddenly like a key too old for her pocket, but perhaps meant to open something. She tried to make sense of the elder's motions. Without meaning to, without planning it, she rose. The chair scraped, and all eyes turned like a camera asking for a close-up. "Miss White Lime," someone called, the syllables oddly formal. "You are here." She did not go willingly to the center. She was drawn as if by gravity. The floor under her feet seemed the same as before, but the air had changed every molecule of its atmosphere. The old man's eyes fixed on her, as if he could read the history beneath her skin. There was a quality to his stare that made small things feel enormous and large things feel fragile. At the edge of the auction floor, someone in a dark suit began to mutter that this could not be allowed. There was talk of interruptions, of protocol, of how the Bai name must never be dragged into sordid displays. He Jingchuan's hand flexed. He leaned toward Shen Sisi, as if to pull her closer and signal that they were an unassailable unit. Shen Sisi squeezed his hand back with a practiced serenity. The auction director looked from the elder to the case and then to the old man again. The gavel sat on the desk like a sleeping predator. The night held its breath. A small child might have clapped, thinking it was part of the show, but there was no applause. White Lime stood with the golden invitation folded like a blunt secret in her purse. She had no idea what the card meant beyond the thin shock that it seemed suddenly important. Yet importance and meaning are not always measured by comprehension. Sometimes they are known by the way the room shifts, the way men straighten, the way the chandeliers feel like witnesses. She felt, with an expanding certainty, that something larger than fatigue and humiliation had been placed into her hands long ago, as if someone else had been waiting to answer an old debt. He Jingchuan thought fast. He thought of cameras and reputations and investors. He thought of statements and press rooms. He thought, with the brutal arithmetic of self-preservation, that anything that could entangle his name to a family of that magnitude needed immediate neutralization. He rose, moving before any formalities could be addressed. His voice, when he spoke, carried the clipped authority of a man issuing a correction. "This is a private matter," he declared. "We will not let rumors dictate our evening." The elderly man's gaze did not move. He raised his token and said only one more thing, as if the syllables were a verdict and a benediction all in one. The word was not loud. It was not even much of a word. It was recognition given like a coin tossed on the table. But recognition, in rooms of lineage and history, can act like verdict and title both. Silence spread like a film over the crowd. The in-laws stopped breathing in unison. Somewhere, a glass trembled. Members of the Bai family, who had been murmuring at the back, set their faces like carved stone. No one disagreed out loud. No one moved. White Lime felt the pulse at her throat slow and then quicken. She understood in a way that had nothing to do with contracts and everything to do with identity. Something ancient and enormous had been nudged toward her by the weight of a little card in a laundromat coat. The world that had laughed at her in the banquet now held still. He Jingchuan's smile slipped, and for the first time that night, his hand reached, not for control, but for information. He leaned toward his companion and asked, too softly for anyone else to hear, "Do you know what that means?" Shen Sisi did not answer at once. Her face was a mask of perfect calm. When she spoke, it was measured. "It means they recognize claims. It means influence. It means nothing yet," He Jingchuan finished, but his voice lacked conviction. From the back of the room someone murmured, a phrase rolling like a pebble that might start an avalanche. "If the Bai family validates..." The sentence did not finish. The gavel had not yet fallen. The auction was still in motion. The elders whispered. People moved like chess pieces, uncertain of their own loyalties. White Lime stood with the card like a small stubborn flare. Outside, the night air was cool and smelled faintly of river. Lanterns bobbed along the boulevard, each one a small flaming witness to a city that liked to believe nothing ancient could touch its present. Inside, the chandelier light made the gold of a token look like a promise. And somewhere in the back, a man named He Jingchuan, whose alleged involvement had been a thin thread through the company's troubles, sat with his face half-shadowed, watching as reputations bent and the city considered the possibility of a reversal. He had his own reasons to be present. Accusations had been thrown, and truth had been slippery. The auction room had become not only a theater of lineage, but a battleground for fortunes that now could be lost or found with a single decision. White Lime did not know then whether the token in the elderly man's hand could undo what men in silk had done to her the week before. She only knew that a night that had been set to cement her smallness had begun to ask new questions the city had not consented to ask before. At the edge of the hall, an aide whispered into He Jingchuan's ear about contingency plans. He looked at White Lime, then away. The lights above them buzzed faintly like insects ignoring a storm. The elderly man clicked his cane on the floor, as though marking time. All at once the auction director raised his gavel and, with the weight of ceremony, struck it once. The sound traveled like a chain being closed. It landed like punctuation, leaving the room aware that the next move would be the kind history notices. And then, in a small moment that felt enormous, the elderly man spoke a name that made the chandeliers seem to hold their breath, and the sound of recognition spread through the hall like a rustle of old money. White Lime's fingers loosened at last on the golden card. The weight of it, finally, matched something in her stomach and in the hall. The future had begun to realign itself around an axis she had not chosen, but now could not avoid. Outside, beyond the glass and the lanterns, the city went on. Taxi horns, a vendor calling, lovers returning to late tables, and inside, men with suits and women with delicate gloves began to realize that decisions made in the past could sometimes arrive uninvited in the present. The auction continued, but it had changed. The gavel's rhythm was now keyed to an outcome no one could predict. He Jingchuan, who had thought himself conductor of a precise orchestra, looked finally like a man who might have missed a cue. The room, which had once laughed together, now held its breath as history gathered itself to speak. And in that silence, White Lime opened her mouth for the first time that night. Her voice was small but steady when she said, "This card is mine." All eyes found her, and the golden invitation in one motion. The elderly man nodded once, as if in recognition. The city listened. It was a moment that would later be called many things. For now, it was simply a pivot, a hinge on which a night's expectations swung into uncertain territory. He Jingchuan felt a cold shape in his chest, like someone had opened a door inside him that revealed what might slip away. He had chosen ambition once and in the process had divorced what he could not see as valuable. That choice had been confident. Now the world tilted in ways he had not foreseen. White Lime held the card the way a palm holds an ember, careful not to burn, careful not to crush the small thing that might yet warm her life. The ring on her finger was dull in the chandelier light. It felt smaller than the card, but no less real. The promise it had carried had been broken, but promises, like debts or legends, could have strange cures if the world allowed them. The room hummed with the electricity of a story changing course. People shuffled, whispering. The four young masters exchanged looks that contained the economy of the city. Shen Sisi's hand trembled once where it rested on He Jingchuan's sleeve. He looked at her as if to anchor himself, and she met his eyes with the kind of steadiness that often presages a decision. Outside, a lantern drifted upward and vanished into the night as if the city's breath had swallowed a small light. Inside, with all the cameras and the people and their tastes for spectacle, an old token and a laundromat coat had suddenly become the axis on which manners and fortunes might pivot. No one knew yet if it meant salvation, ruin, vindication, or cruelty. They only knew it had happened in the worst possible place for He Jingchuan to have it happen, the room where he had intended to show men how decisive he could be. Now the room was showing him a different kind of consequence, one that justice, rumor, and lineage all seemed to hold together. He sat very still, as if his future were a glass being rotated in someone's hand, and waited to see which way the light would hit it. He sat very still, as if his future were a glass being turned in someone's hand, and waited to see which way the light would hit it. The elder's hand lowered slowly, the gold seal catching the chandelier's breath and throwing it back in a thin, relentless line. In the hush that followed, the auction's rhythm fractured. People who had come to buy curiosities found their hands empty. Those who had come to perform confidence felt a cold draft where certainty used to be. He Jingchuan's chest felt hollow, as if some private engine had been stilled by the quiet. Someone near the front, a woman who wore money like armor, whispered the name plainly, Bai Chengning. The syllables landed like a stone. A ripple of recognition moved through the room. It was small at first, and then large, as if a curtain the city had been hanging over its own past had been tugged in one corner. The Bai family's name, once a rumor that hung in the back rooms of the old districts, carried weight that did not always show itself until the exact moment it was needed. Tonight was such a moment. The elderly man who had held the token nodded once and said to the room, "This card bears the housemark. It is not a trinket, it is a summons." An assistant hurried forward with a microphone. The cameras, which had been circling the edges of the hall like a tide, pivoted toward White Lime and the old man. For the first time in weeks, she felt the world narrow to the small warmth of the golden invitation in her coat pocket and the dull weight of the ring on her finger. He Jingchuan rose as if to argue, to cut the air between recognition and consequence with his practiced rhetoric. He found his voice and tried to shape it into command. "This is theater," he said. "We cannot let legends disrupt a night meant for—" "That's not theater," the elder interrupted quietly, and with a voice that made the chandelier listen. "This is lineage. This is history. The housemark speaks when it must." The auction director, Chong, who had been orchestrating the show like a conductor, paled the smallest fraction. He looked at the elder, then at the case where the invitations lay like saline in a hospital tray, and he cleared his throat. "If the Bai family recognizes this," he said slowly, "protocol requires we treat it as authentic until proven otherwise." Two words floated through the room and landed like an anchor. Recognized and protocol. People loved certainty no matter how small the proof. Both words suggested a ladder they could climb out of discomfort. For the crowd that had come to judge White Lime, neither word was allied to her. For her, they might be a hand. A murmur began, then thickened into a chorus. The press leaned forward, the young masters straightened, investors imagined margins. He Jingchun's smile thinned. Shen Sisi's eyes tightened into a line. The in-laws, who had been so giddy an hour before, sat as if a photo of them had somehow been developed and revealed something unflattering at its edges. The elder rose from his seat and moved toward her. He did not sweep the room. He moved as a man following a thread. When he reached her, he stopped and looked at her face like a man who had been reading the same text for decades and had suddenly found the name he sought. "You carry it," he said, and the words were both small and enormous. White Lime found herself answering without thinking. "It was in a coat I left at the laundromat." The elder smiled as if her answer made the pattern of a tapestry clearer. "The Bai do not lose what belongs to them," he said. "They may send what they must." From the back of the room, a younger man with the posture of someone accustomed to dispatching other people's crises, a Bai family liaison, stepped forward. He had been mild-mannered until now, but something in his face sharpened, as if he had been waiting for the precise moment to become visible. He took the golden card from her, unfolded it, and held it where the light could read it. He ran a finger over the seal, then over the calligraphy, and then looked at Chang. "This is original," he said. "We will verify details, but the housemark matches an archive piece." The auction director hesitated, then made a motion that was almost ceremonial. He withdrew the glass case's lid with hands that did not tremble but were careful to be seen as careful. The cameras leaned in. The elder touched the token inside and nodded. The liaison stepped back and said simply, "Miss White-Lime, you are recognized as a claimant." "That is all I can say without the elder's full word, but you have standing. We will take this to the elders' council." A reporter at the edge of the crowd, who had been taking notes with the casual cruelty of someone used to breaking private lives in public, snapped a picture. The flash caught the promise ring on White-Lime's finger and made it a bright, ironic punctuation to the scene. He Jingchuan's face went very white. He had calculated 1,000 ways to shift attention tonight. New contracts to parade, new alliances to show. Shen Xixi's poised shoulder as living proof of a life properly arranged. He had not included the possibility that someone from the margins, someone his family had publicly denounced, would be claimed by the very lineages they pretended to admire. It was a mistake of taste, of timing, and of hubris. The auction hadn't ended. Objects were still moving hands, a jade comb, a lacquered scroll, but their sale felt like an afterthought, as if the real business of the night had moved into the old wing where lineage met ledger. The by-liaison asked for a private place to speak, and the elders gathered like shadows around a single oil lamp. The room hummed with a low new respect. He Jingchuan made a choice in that instant that would haunt him. He rose, stepped toward the old man, and attempted a public correction. "We must not," he began, but the elder's hand lifted in a way that suggested the conversation already belonged to someone older and less indulgent than he. "You have said what you intended tonight," the elder replied, the syllables soft and absolute. "Let the record state that the buy house will consider the claim. Until then, the card is recognized by the house as authentic." He Jingchuan's attempt at containment failed in a single lethal motion. The word recognized was the kind of verb that excited markets. Trades happen in recognition. Partnerships hinge on being seen. Investors listen for housemarks. The press smelled a headline like blood. Within hours, messages would ripple through phone networks and private channels. Analysts speculating, partners reconsidering, a key client expressing concern, words tailored to cause withdrawal without accusation. By morning, rumors of their crisis would merge with White-Lime's new status, and the two currents would become a current strong enough to drag him under. But in the auction hall, in that tightened hour, the world simply watched while a small man in a coat folded the edges of an empire and let it show through a laundromat button. White-Lime felt danger, relief, the dizzy hush of being seen. She had not wanted a crown. She had wanted only a life that honored the promises she had been given and the work she had done. Recognition looked different now that it had arrived. It smelled of lacquer and paper and old money and new cameras. It was not a clean transformation. The by-liaison could not, in a breath, make investors rewrite their balance sheets. He could not, with a single nod, hand over control of city markets. What he could do was create a public shift in legitimacy. The name White-Lime attached to the buy house meant that people who depended on lineage might reassess their bets. Men who valued ancestry enough to color their negotiations with it would take notice. That night, the auction's guests spilled into their cars and cabs with new information. The press ran the story framed like a mystery. From nonsense to claim, the woman who appeared with a housemark. Social feeds heated with commentary. He Jingchuan's phone rewired itself into a sequence of urgent calls. He had expected praise for his decisiveness, not the faint seismic cracking sound of alliance realignment. The next morning the company met in a glassed boardroom that had seemed to breathe a different air all week, thinner, more clinical. He Jingchuan walked into it with the practiced actor's gait of a man who had rehearsed controlling storms. His phone buzzed at his hip like a heartbeat. He tried to speak in calm notes, words that announced measures, promised transparency, and suggested a steady hand. But the room had already been seeded by rumors. An email from a major buyer had circulated at dawn expressing concerns. An investment partner had frozen discussions pending clarification. The board's faces were sympathetic on the surface and already drafting internal narratives about risk. "We need to present certainty," his CFO said, voice tight. "We need to be decisive." He Jingchuan found himself speaking as if to a mirror, rehearsing lines he hoped would be true. We will investigate Yang Shikun's alleged involvement. We will cooperate fully. We will show our partners we are stable. Alleged, the head counsel corrected softly, as if by inserting that caveat the world might remain lawful and neat. The word hung like a thin veil. Outside, media cycles were already comparing the two stories, the man who had discarded a wife for appearance and the woman who might be a bi. The internet, hungry for irony, began to stitch the two together. Headlines that a few days ago had praised He Jingchuan's ambitions now asked whether his choices were moral or merely expedient. Stock reports suggested a slide. Whispers suggested a withdrawal. He Jingchuan felt the air grow colder around him, like winter moving room to room. Desperation, being a creature of habit, makes people revert to what has worked before. He Jingchuan called his parents, who answered in the practiced tone of people used to smoothing edges with denials. He called friends who had been useful and found their phone lines suspiciously busy. He called Shen Sisi. She answered, measured, calm, the way a trained diplomat answers calls that might decide another person's fate. What should we do? He asked, and the question was both practical and naked. Control the message, she said. Show resolve. Make clear that claims won't distract you. His mother, when he reached her, did not speak words of comfort. She cited investors, the importance of clean lines, and the embarrassment the family might suffer if association with a house claim caused reputational risk. He listened and felt the world yield to a single axis, the city's appetite for the illusion of certainty. Meanwhile, White Lime did not sleep well. The auction's recognition had not erased the memory of the banquet's laughter. It had not erased nights at the noodle shop or the feel of cheap linens against her palms. But the election of a new axis into her life had opened doors she had not asked to step through. The bi-liaison had asked for patience. The elders would convene, verify and speak. She had left him with her contact as if she were returning a borrowed book. From the clinic where she worked, from the modest rental she had taken, she watched the city rearrange itself around a rumor that now had more substance. Patients came and went. Small people continued to live lives that were not scripted by auctions. She treated colds, stitched tears in a child's trousers, measured blood pressure in elderly men who had never owned a golden invitation to their names. The world she had chosen had its own dignity that refused to be erased by glint or shame. Then, in the late afternoon, a call came that turned worry into crisis. It began as a rumor in a chat group, and then solidified into a voice on the other end of He Jingchuan's phone. One of their largest distributors, citing business uncertainty and risk, had decided to hold back shipments and payments. Another partner had requested immediate reassessment of their contracts. The company's liquidity, already fragile, moved further toward an edge. He Jingchuan convened an emergency meeting. He walked in with the sort of small, sharp steps people take when they are trying to preserve an architecture of self they've spent years constructing. The boardroom's mood had tipped from concern to the precise edge between pragmatism and panic. "We can't let this metastasize," the CFO said. "If more partners pull back, we face an indeterminate shortage." He Jingchuan looked at the faces he had once imagined standing behind him forever. They looked back like cavalries turned away. He made a decision in that room that he had perhaps made 1,000 times in less fraught contexts. Call in favors. He reached for the phone, for men who owed him past debts, for shareholders who might be moved by the right impetus. But favors, unlike debts, require goodwill, and goodwill had a habit of evaporating when the wind shifts. The morning after the auction, investors were already scheduling calls with analysts. The rumor of buy recognition had reframed the risk profile. Being tied in public to one kind of lineage could scare some partners. Being tied in private to scandal could worry others. He Jingchuan's carefully arranged life began to tilt. He called his parents. He called Shen Sisi. He called allies. He tried to assemble a narrative that saved the company's value and his own skin. The calls were answered with concern, with offers to assist where we can, and with the faint, formalized sympathy of people who know that rescuing another's fall can implicate them in a plummet. Then, when the room had filled with the uneasy music of retreat, news, vague and explosive, arrived. Yang Shikun had been found unconscious in his apartment. Hospital staff at the municipal had confirmed he was under care. The media picked up the breathless angle of link to sabotage alleged. and hospitalization fuels speculation. None of it was proof. All of it was narrative. In the fevered market of public opinion, narrative often behaves like evidence. He Jingchuan heard the news like a final bell. He left the meeting and went, as always, to the one place he believed could still bend events, his family home. His parents greeted him with the neutral courtesy reserved for weather reports. They did not offer absolution, they offered a fold of practicalities. His mother spoke of timing, of reputational triage. Their sympathy was economized and portioned. But the worst things are the small betrayals. He called a man who had been a mentor, a person whose introductions had once mattered, and the man did not pick up. He called a partner who had benefited from his deals, and the partner sent a message, "Let's monitor, for now we need distance." Nobody wanted to be near someone sounding like a jewel in danger. As the company's days lengthened into a blur of emergency statements, another image began to form, a table full of empty seats where loyalty had once sat. The old alliances that had seemed to him as guaranteed as law were revealed as fragile covenants, given out when convenient and withdrawn when their cost rose. Word spread that the Bai family would make a statement soon. Investors, like bees, moved toward any nectar of clarity. If the Bai confirmed White Lime's claim, those who wanted to distance themselves from scandal might pivot toward new alliances. Those who wished to secure purchase in the right side of the wind might withdraw and reposition. In markets as in social rooms, perception was always the currency that moved the most wealth. He Jingchuan tried to anticipate. He rehearsed messages that sounded muscular. We will be transparent. We will protect employees. We will investigate the alleged sabotage thoroughly. But his words felt tinny. In the crowd sway of reputations, a line of copy cannot always compete with a housemark or the suggestion of lineage. The company's lights flickered, contracts paused, offices grew quiet. Men who had once smiled at displays of bravado now widened the distance between their firms and his. In the middle of it all, He Jingchuan made one last attempt at rescue, not for the company alone, but for himself. He called the Bai liaison whose courtesy at the auction had felt like both a mercy and the opening of a door. The liaison answered. He Jingchuan, for the first time that evening, talked plainly. He did not say, "You owe us." He said, "If the Bai can stabilize perception, my firm will be able to—" He stumbled for the right verb, for the correct posture. "We can restructure, manage reputational risk, and continue." The liaison listened with a discretion that was almost ceremonial. When he spoke, he framed his words in the language the Bai used: obligations, stewardship, and the care due to the household's name. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He said, "The house will consider its interests, not the interests of a man who has publicly renounced a claimant." The sentence arrived like a verdict in a language He Jingchuan did not fully understand. He felt small. Desperation speeds into error. He Jingchuan made one phone call he would later regret, in ways that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with human cost. He called White Lime. When she saw his name on the clinic phone, her first instinct was to hang up. The ring was the memory of 7 years of promises attached to a man who had turned those promises into spectacle. Her thumb hovered. She remembered the ring he had given her under a neon stall, and the way he had looked at her then, with a kind of blunt, aching sincerity. She also remembered the banquet's theatrics, and the way they had stripped her. She answered because some debts are not only financial, they are the work of closure. He Jingchuan's voice quivered, less from fear of the market than from the rawness of seeing a person who had once been the most intimate part of his life, and now being rejected by the only loyalty he thought unassailable. "Please," he said, "you must help me. The investors are pulling back. The buyers are pausing. If the Bai can intervene." White Lime listened. The clinic's fluorescent lights hummed. She heard his words, measured, the way someone catalogues a long illness. "Help you," she repeated slowly. Her voice had the coolness of someone who had been very near to breaking and had learned an economy of responses. "You broke what you promised. You left me in front of people because it was convenient." "I was protecting the company," he pleaded. "From what? From the truth?" she asked. "You protected your image at my expense." There was a long silence. Between them was an ocean of choices. His was panic. Hers was a measured map of what she could and would do. The Bai house had not yet spoken fully. She had not yet been given authority to act. But whatever the elders decided to offer her, it would not be an impulse rescue to a man who had made humiliation a public ceremony. "I can help the people who work for you," she said finally, and her voice was simple. "Your employees, the ones who did not choose to be collateral. I can ask the house to provide temporary aid and to ensure wages are covered while your situation is resolved." His voice broke. "And me?" "You made your choice," she said. "You published the divorce. You decided you needed a life unencumbered. I will not be called back to patch up the cost you calculated away." He Jingchuan's plea became small after that. He offered apologies, grown soft from the shocks of reputation and fear. He begged for the possibility of reconciliation, if he would only say the words publicly, if he would explain, if he would. He searched for a formula that might erase the banquet's laughter. He offered to resign in ways that felt like humiliation being repackaged as generosity. He said he had made a mistake, that his love had been misread, that he had been, what? Ambitious? Human? White Lime kept her answers spare. "I will not be your safety net," she said, "not after what you made me live through." He hung up with a sound like a knot being pulled loose. In the boardroom, people sent each other messages to say they were monitoring the situation. In the markets, a trickle of withdrawals became a small stream. The Bai elders called a council meeting. White Lime, who had never wanted the attention that had been thrust upon her, sat among men and women who were as curiously intimate as they were ancient in their customs. They wanted to know the truth. She told them what she could: the laundromat coat, the golden card, the fragmentary details of a childhood not yet claimed. She told them that she had been poor but that poverty was not a crime. She told them that she had worked and had learned dignity in small rooms that did not require laurels. The elders listened as if every life was a ledger that needed careful reading. They asked for proof, for references, for the patterns of a life that might tie to their own archives. They called for time. They requested names. Their questions were fragile instruments designed to separate the frayed facts from what might be myth. As they spoke, news continued its relentless work. The city has many tendrils. Partners who had once promised mutual insurance now sent private notes. Men who had smiled recently in He Jingchuan's orbit began to arrange themselves into new parties. The company, which had stood for a kind of promise of future growth, found itself adrift in a sea of present anxieties. At the clinic, White Lime could not ignore the human consequences. The employees of He Jingchuan's firm were being left in the cold, not because their work was bad, but because reputations change faster than ledgers. She began to think of the seamstresses who mended shirts for executives, the drivers who rose at dawn, the cafeteria workers who fed meetings, and office juniors who had dreams that did not include familial infamy. She went to the elders and asked, in a voice that did not plead but commanded charity, that whatever recognition they gave her be used, at least at first, to protect the innocent. She did not ask for the full house. She asked that livelihoods be preserved and that a city not be allowed to eat people for sport. The Bai elders, who had watched families rise and fall, saw in her a kind of steady argument they could appreciate. It was not bold or showy. It did not promise dramatic reversals or scorched earth. It suggested stewardship. Use your power to keep the small things from tipping into ruin. "Very well," said one elder, who had the look of a man used to balancing ancient law with modern need. "We will deploy resources. We will provide temporary credit lines for payroll where necessary, and will reach out to partners with assurances anchored in the house's networks. But this does not mean we rescue ambition that scorns humanity." The words were practical, measured. They were not mercy given as spectacle. They were stewardship, a decision that would help preserve the lives of people who had no claim to dynastic grace. The elders' offer was a kind of righteousness that resembled careful arithmetic. It did not speak of public retribution. It spoke instead of an order that preserved small people while letting those who had chosen to burn bridges face consequences. When White Lime learned of the elders' decision, she felt a complex relief. Her first thought had not been of empire, but of the seamstresses and the drivers and the interns who might go hungry if accounts froze. She thought of the clinic's regulars who would be affected by a local supplier's collapse. She thought, suddenly and thoroughly, of the tether of community. He Jingchuan, meanwhile, watched as the last supports he had presumed as permanent slipped. An investor who had been vocal in his praise issued a terse statement. "In light of recent developments, we are reassessing exposure." A buyer who had once vied for the company's favors pulled contracts citing operational concerns. The combined effect was swift. Cash flow tightened, payroll lines paused, and the company's public valuation took a stinging hit. He did not get to call the elders and ask for a handout. He had cut that rope himself when he had laughed in the banquet hall and dressed his cruelty in the language of expedience. The market is a mirror that favors those who can promise not just returns but steady hands. It dislikes men who dissolve promises into spectacle. As the company's troubles became real, He Jingchuan made one last feverish attempt to salvage what he could. He called shareholders, partners, and complicated friends. He promised restructuring. He promised transparency. He promised letters of apology. He offered to step down in exchange for softness of public commentary. He attempted to bargain with the very currency he had once used to buy advantage, image. The city, quicker than he had anticipated, had no appetite for theatrical turnaround that did not feel genuine. They had already seen his theater, the banquet, the ring, the slap of public humiliation. Integrity, once publicly munched, is difficult to resurrect in any convincing form. In the middle of his collapse, a hospital call arrived that tightened the chest of everyone who heard it. He Jingchuan's mother, who had been the loudest voice in the banquet's chorus, had fainted and been admitted with stress-induced arrhythmia. The family, who had been arranging the departure of what they perceived as embarrassment, now found themselves in a new kind of emergency that required care, not performance. He went to the hospital and saw his mother in a bed, like an accident of his own making. Her hand was small in his. He felt the weight of the papers at home, the divorce he had demanded, the signatures he had orchestrated, like evidence being laid on a table between them. He wanted, perhaps for the first time in years, to be saved not by image but by the small acts that make life tolerable, a presence at a bedside, the quiet of a nurse offering tea. He called White Lime again from the doorway of the ICU, the machines beeping a rhythm that sounded like counting. She answered because she had discovered that certain responsibilities are not erased by insults or ambition. "I need help," he said, and the words were not polished. They had the raw edge of someone who felt the bottom drop out of the stage he had constructed. White Lime listened. On the other end was a man who had traded their shared past for a better future. On the receiving end was a woman who had learned how to keep the small things alive when the world wanted to turn them into entertainment. "I'll help the hospital cover immediate costs," she said. "They can't wait for politics." "You will?" he asked, surprised and small. "For those who need care," she said. "But I will not be the instrument that cleans your name. There is a difference between caring for human beings and being a bailiff for your choices." He Jingchuan's shoulders sagged with a slow public shame. In the hospital corridor, the world had reduced to fluorescent tiles and the smell of disinfectant. Papers could be signed later. People could not be brought back from hunger by legalese. White Lime organized the aid quietly through the buy house's contacts and the elders' network, making sure doctors who needed resources had them. She did not announce the help with fanfare. She insisted the care be respectfully offered and not used as a press tool. The elders agreed. "Mercy," they told her later, "is most moral when it is not declared as a headline." The city watched, through midday feeds and gossip columns, as the story shifted from a banquet's cruelty to a more complex, slower truth. Headlines that once mocked had to recalibrate. Some writers tried to suggest that He Jingchuan's fall was a mere bump. Others sniffed at the buy house's intervention as evidence that social debt is always solvable with money. Some opined that the market's reaction was a sign of the city's cultivated taste for scandal over substance. The tale's emotional truth, however, remained simple. He had chosen to humiliate her publicly for ambition. She had been wounded, but had not become petty. When a house offered her a path not to vengeance but to stewardship, she accepted, with boundaries. When the company faltered, she chose to protect the innocents and not to play savior to a man who had turned cruelty into policy. There were moments, in the months that followed, when the consequences of that choice rippled loudly. He Jingchuan watched as partners pivoted toward different alliances, some seeking association with the buy house in hopes of favorable terms. Others, suspicious of dynasty, preferred to distance themselves from the entire spectacle. Contracts shifted hands quietly. Shareholders who had once been loyal now spoke of counts and risks. The company, once a bright object of his ambition, slowly shrank from the edges inward as managers reevaluated and clients renegotiated. He grew quieter. The confident lines that had outlined his life gave way to small, careful movements. The in-laws, who had been proud at the banquet, now found themselves fielding awkward phone calls and polite distance from the city's high table. Shen Sisi, who had been lauded as a symbol of newness, found her own standing uncertain as alliances evolved. She had risen in skill and temperament, but the city's appetite for loyalty had been rebalanced. White Lime's life became one of new stewardship. The Bai elders, who had seen many claimants and many fictions, guided her in ways that were not merely ceremonial. They asked for patience, for a measured release of resources, and for an attention to the many small people who are often swallowed by the appetite of markets. Under their aegis, she influenced the redirection of funds to preserve employees' wages, to secure interim credit for suppliers, and to ensure the families whose lives were interwoven with the company could breathe. She refused to use her position as a hammer against her husband. She refused to become a mouthpiece of vengeance. Instead, she set conditions: a public acknowledgement, a private negotiation for the families harmed, and a program to ensure fair treatment for workers. In private, when He Jingchuan begged, she offered him a stair but not a highway. He would need to make amends in public, not by groveling but by taking responsibility. He was not prepared. Pride is not so easily unlearned, and public humility is often a craft that must be practiced before it is believable. He attempted a public statement that had the right words but none of the weight of truth. It sounded manufactured. The city smelled the performance and shrugged. Forgiveness, they knew, cannot be staged. One evening, months after the auction, He Jingchuan sat alone in the boardroom that once felt like a temple. The room now held fewer faces. Papers lay where once there had been confidence. The ring, the small band of metal that had been a promise and then a prop in a spectacle, sat in a shallow velvet box on the table. He opened it, turned it over in his hand, and thought of the neon stall where his life had been simple and messy and full of human feeling. White Lime, in a house that now had rooms she did not know how to occupy comfortably, walked through corridors that smelled of old wood and careful preservation. She had been offered a seat at the table, not because she wanted to lord it over the city, but because the elders believed in stewardship. She found herself thinking of the market women, the drivers, the clinic's patients, and how the city's hunger could be soothed by modest acts. The empire, when it settled into her life, felt less like a thing to possess and more like a responsibility to practice with hands that had never sought domination. There were small public moments where the city watched the arc close. He Jingchuan attempted an appeal to the public, a humble letter in a measured column, an admission that he had caused pain by prioritizing image over person. The name of the Bai house was not in that letter. It could not be. Their intervention was quiet, a steward's hand, not a spectacle. People read the letter with the same appetite they read stories about kings fallen from horses. Some believed him, some did not. The four young masters returned to their lives, their faces less rounded with triumph. Shen Sisi kept her position for a while, then moved on to other roles where her network mattered less to the city's gossip and more to her private career. The final quiet reckoning was not a headline, but a single ordinary scene. He Jingchuan, who had been the composer of a public divorce and the architect of humiliation, stood outside the old river market one morning at dawn, where the smell of vegetables and frying oil and the human ordinances of market life braided into the city's oldest music. He had come, a man who once quite deliberately left, to buy fruit for his mother, who had recovered enough to prefer fresh pears and to complain about the heat. He watched vendors set out their baskets and children exchange small coins for treats. He could have sought White Lime, he did not. He lingered in the distance, watching the life he had once been part of, the arithmetic of small trades, the dignity of barter, the way laughter rose without cameras. She passed by, her coat tucked against the morning, the ring on her finger catching a little light. He saw her and did not call. She had long ago reclaimed what mattered, a measure of peace, a new kind of respect, and the knowledge that power, when it arrives, can be used to stitch wounds rather than tear them open. The Bai house had given her resources. The elders had underlined that stewardship requires both mercy and the courage not to indulge vengeance. She had used their influence to protect the workers, to calm markets, and to ensure that the city's appetite for spectacle did not become a weapon that swallowed lives. He Jingchuan watched her go and felt a final very human regret. The rings, the invitations, the auction buzz had all become symbols in a narrative that had loosened him from comfort. He had married ambition into cruelty and found it a poor companion. In the months that followed, the company stabilized at a new size. It no longer gleamed in the way it once did, but the people who kept its desks clean still had their pay. The seamstresses who had once mended jackets for executives still had orders. Ships that had once threatened to stop now moved again, because creditors had been reassured by new partners who had little appetite for chaos. White Lime visited the clinic and sat with the patients. She signed papers with the Bai elders, not to aggrandize herself, but to grow programs that fed markets and training, to teach those who wanted to be entrepreneurs how to survive when the city loves spectacle more than steadiness. She sat at tables where old men with thick histories drank tea and told small stories. She treated her ring as a relic of a promise that had changed shape but had not died. The city, which likes tidy endings, made room for a new kind, not a dramatic crowning but a quiet correction. He Jingchuan, now watched with a kind of distant curiosity, tried to rebuild an honest life. He did not recover everything he had lost. Some colleagues refused his calls, some friends did not return texts. The public remembers easily and forgets with difficulty. He learned what almost all men learn when they ask the wrong thing of other humans, that there are debts that cannot be repaid with speeches. The elders, who had watchful patience, advised her to let time do some of the work. Power is poor without compassion, one said, but compassion without boundaries can become its own tyranny. She took the line and made it a compass, used the house's weight to protect the small, ask accountability of the large, and guard against the intoxication of revenge. There was, in the end, a single small ceremony that stitched the opening night to the final calm. The Bai House organized a lantern release not as spectacle but as remembrance, each flame a small witness. White Lime stood at the river's edge, lantern in hand, the ring snug on her finger. He Jingchuan watched from a distance, having been invited in the manner of those who had once offended and now sought a place to learn how to be present without commandeering the scene. He had not come to reclaim titles, he had come to witness. She lit her lantern and let it go. It rose slow and bright, a small point that grew distant and then joined others to make a soft constellation. The city exhaled with it. For some, the lanterns were a show. For others, they were a confession of things people could not say aloud. For White Lime, they were an answer to a long equation. Power can be used to cut or to heal. She had chosen, publicly, deliberately, and with the elders' counsel, to heal. He Jingchuan's eyes followed the lanterns until they were small. He realized then, with the particular cruelty of a man understanding too late, that the woman he had discarded had become someone the city needed for reasons he could not undo. He had sought to use her smallness as a prop, and had found instead that legacy is not born of spectacle but of steadiness. The house had recognized her when it mattered. He had recognized her too late. White Lime did not stand and proclaim victory. She did not return to the banquet to scorn. She kept the ring as a memory of what had been, and used the empire that had found her to do what small mercies require. She had been humiliated. She had been betrayed. She had been offered a position in a house that asked her to choose how to use power. She chose dignity. When the city later spoke of the affair, some called it a tale of reversal, and others a lesson about pride. The headline that satisfied the less curious declared simply that he had been humiliated and she had been recognized. But headlines flatten. They do not tell you about the way a woman who once sold vegetables can move through rooms of lacquer and oil with the same humility she uses to tie a bandage. At the very end of the story, the final image returns to the ring and the golden invitation, motifs that had been anchors since the first humiliation. The ring sat in a small box, not cast off as if it had been worthless but kept as a reminder. The golden invitation, now framed in a modest place in her new office, served as a token of responsibility rather than ownership. Lanterns drifted on, the city breathed, and a man who had chosen ambition over tenderness found himself alone with decisions he had made in light. He Jingchuan had cheated and humiliated her. The world had applauded for a night. When the Bai House's seal made her claim public, When the auction hall's light bent to reveal a lineage no one expected, it was too late for the old alliances to help him. What had been taken from her could not be perfectly returned, but fairness, the small human kind, was restored for those who mattered most. The workers, the neighbors, the quiet people whose lives are rarely on the front page. White Lime stood by the river with a lantern in hand and let it go, not as triumph, but as release. The empire that had found her did not erase pain, but it reframed responsibility. The man who had once thrown her ring across a banquet table watched its light disappear into the evening and understood that some revelations, no matter how glorious, arrive too late. If this story moved you, stay for more tales of how truth and consequence find their way through the city's lights, and consider subscribing to follow what happens next.